Welcome to A Conversation with History. I'm Harry Kreisler of the Institute of International Studies. Our guest today is David Ward, who is the President-elect of the American Council on Education. David Ward is the former Chancellor of the University of Wisconsin at Madison. A geographer, he is the Charles Kendall Adams University Professor and Director of the Wisconsin Center for the Advancement of Post-Secondary Education. He's the author of several books, including Poverty, Ethnicity, and the American City, Changing Conceptions of the Slum and the Ghetto, 1840 to 1920, and Cities and Immigrants, A Geography of Change in 19th Century America. David, welcome to Berkeley.
Delighted to be here.
Where were you born and raised?
Manchester, England, and I was there until the age of 18 and traveled across the Pennines to the northeast side of England, to Leeds, where I received my undergraduate degree. And so I'm a child of the North Country of England. Never had a BBC accent.
And how do you, in retrospect, do you think your parents shaped your character?
Well, I think the main thing was that even though they were not educated themselves, they sensed that the North Country of England in the 40s and 50s was a place that really didn't quite know where it was going. It was clearly not depressed, but it was an economy without direction. And I think they both sensed that maximum choice would occur through education. And I think both, particularly in high school, which at that time was pretty tough in England, very selective, they gave me a lot of support, which eventually got me into college. So I think their support was a sort of recognition that I don't think they ever thought I was going to end up in North America, but they certainly sensed that there was a sort of exit visa that could come from having a college education.
And what impressions are you left with of that in urban environment that you were raised in, and what do you think, in what ways do you think it shaped you?
Well, I think the first thing is that it was a provincial environment in the best sense of the word. I suppose in the United States, New England, Texan, in other words, southeast Lancashire and the area in and around Manchester and Liverpool, it eventually became either notorious or famous through the Beatles, but there was a subculture that revolved around the various elements of popular culture, like soccer on the one hand and popular music, but on the other hand, one of the world's great orchestras, the Halley Orchestra. Some of the cultural life of Manchester was one of the the quiet elements of that culture. And I think I grew up in this sort of polarity of a kind of North Country provincial culture that still had this window on a more cosmopolitan culture. It's also a city that was surprisingly diverse ethnically. A considerable second and third generation Irish population, a very large Jewish population, significant numbers of Italians and Greeks, and it was this old 19th century commercial city still preserving this sort of diversity. So it was, on the one hand, a very provincial city, and one felt very proud to be provincial and not sort of mainstream English. But on the other hand, it was quite cosmopolitan. So I got, I think, a nice balance between a sort of local identity and a kind of cosmopolitan exposure.
And your father was a shopkeeper.
Right.
And what do you think you learned from that experience that was helpful later?
Well, of course, we were a news agency, and in England, the newspapers were organized in a small store, and the newspaper delivery boy delivered all newspapers, weekly and daily, so they were assembled. And I suppose in assembling them, my exposure to public life, political life, was unavoidable. So I have this, I was sort of overexposed, if you like, to many great newspapers through either putting them up, stopping, reading an article, delivering them, stopping, reading an article. So that was important, I think, that you couldn't avoid being well educated. And this was an era, of course, great journalism. Manchester Guardian, for example, was one of the world's great newspapers. We also sold, it was a corner store, sold many other things too. But I suppose I learned from that the whole ma and pa store experience, which anybody will tell you is both a wonderful exposure to being enterprising, but also a little prison, in the sense that it ties you to the job in ways that are like a dairy farm. And so, I also grew up with this tension between being tied to the store and yet at the same time the kind of values that come out of growing up in a store, serve you well from a common sense point of view for the rest of your life.
Mm-hmm. And what about your education before you went off to the university? How did that broaden your horizons, if it did?
Well, in England, of course, it was very Darwinian. There was an examination at the age of 11, and that then thinned you down to go to high school rather than what was later called a secondary modern school. And I survived that examination at 11. I don't quite know why or how, but I did. And so then I went on to a grammar school. And then at 15, you take a set of examinations, again statewide, in all the subjects that you've taken. And on the basis of that examination, you then get to do another 3 years, which was called the sixth form. I survived that. And then if you get decent grades in the subjects in the sixth form, you get to go to college. I think that, in some ways, I felt that I was not always mature enough to cope with the material I was being taught. It moved very fast. It was very demanding. And if you weren't agile and mature, particularly in the humanities, I was exposed to poetry at a level of sophistication at 14 that I don't really believe I was ready for. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, I think it stretched me. And so I look to it as an era in which I've retrospectively got a great deal of benefit from. And what I took away from it was being really stretched intellectually in high school. I don't believe that's good for everybody. I believe I was motivated enough and prepared enough to do this. But I recall in the sixth form, 4 nights a week, there would be 3 to 4 hours homework, usually essays or problem solving in the sciences. This was not an easy experience, and you had to be kind of pretty tough to do that. So I sort of came away with deep knowledge and toughness, but not what I would call broad knowledge or self-knowledge. I think that came from college and came later.
And you were telling me earlier that you actually had to pick in high school the major that you were going to take when you went on to Leeds. Tell us about that.
Well, when you, at 15, you take maybe 8 or 9 subjects nationally, and then you choose 3 of them to do in the sixth form. So you drop down to only 3 subjects. And one of those 3 subjects, more or less, has to be the major in college. Mm-hmm. So basically, by the age 15, you have chosen down to 3 your major, and my 3 subjects were English, history, and geography. And I basically chose geography because I suspect there was a certain amount of practicality in me that made that seem like, well, if I don't become an academic, at least I could become a planner. Mm-hmm. And so it was a very pragmatic decision. And so you apply at the age of 17 or 18 to enter the department, almost like a graduate student would. And so I entered the Department of Geography at Leeds and took then for 3 years virtually nothing but geography.
And did you have any teachers there or professors who really were an important experience for you?
Oh yeah. I would say the person who mentored me the most was a Welshman, Glanville Jones, who recognized early on that conventional geography wasn't intellectually quite my thing, that I was very multidisciplinary, very interested in anthropology and history, and also pretty competent quantitatively. And so he really customized a little bit my program that allowed me to probably get a broader education than might have been normally the case. And it was out of that that I began to move in the area of urban history, which both my books sort of fit in. And there so happened, at Leeds at that time was a very distinguished urban historian called Asa Briggs, who was professor of modern history, and so I had this connection not just with geography but with an extremely distinguished historian. And then the second person who was important was a man called Maurice Beresford, who was an economic historian who loved to relate the landscape to historic processes. So he was sort of part geographer, part historian. And he taught me a great deal about how to read documents and enhance the document by reading the landscape. So it was a really remarkable undergraduate education in many ways. And in retrospect, I'm still amazed at how much I remember from it and how valuable it has remained with me.
Was it hard for you at this time to relate back to the culture that you had come from, or was that an easy navigation?
No, it was quite challenging. I think even a northern British university was an alien environment to anybody who was sort of low middle class, substantial working class or whatever. It was You just would not have had any family exposure to it, and it was not a culture that reached out to you. It was a culture that you responded to. And I think the only way to make it was through academic distinction. There was no shortcut. You became accepted through a sort of meritocratic system. And then your culture and your accent was forgiven, so that your academic precocity was the means to break through. There was no other way to break through. And that was really what happened to me, that in the end I got a first-class degree, which is, you know, kind of like a 4-point type thing. And it's kind of got a credential in England, particularly more so then than now, which sort of defined you as having made it, reached some threshold level, which gave you broad acceptability in British academic life.
And where did you then pursue your graduate work?
Well, I stayed on at Leeds. It was very difficult to change institutions at that time in England. So I was then given a 3-year award to do a PhD at Leeds, which was very common. You'd do your BA and your PhD at the same place. But in the middle of my first year of graduate work, this man, Glanville Jones, who I mentioned, said, David, you know, 4 years of a good thing is too much of a good thing. We need to get you off to Australia or to Europe or to North America for a year and then come back. And so I applied for a Fulbright and received a Fulbright. And his idea was I'd go away for a year and broaden my horizons and then come back and finish the PhD at Leeds. One of the things he then arranged for me, he said, I'm also a little worried that once you leave, you might not come back. And so he had me package what was about half a PhD. In those days in England, the PhD was entirely a research degree, no coursework. So right from the beginning, you prepared your research and you began to write it up. So I actually prepared an interim report on my PhD, which ultimately became my master's degree at Leeds when it became clear I wouldn't return. So he was very smart that he had a contingency plan. And so the question was, where should I go? And in fact, I applied to Michigan, Berkeley, and Wisconsin, the 3 great publics of that time, maybe even still today. And it was so happened that my doctoral major professor was a Canadian, Andrew Clark, who wrote me, and simply the personal interest he showed in me probably was the factor that brought me to Wisconsin. Had I known what the climate is like in Berkeley, as I do today, who knows what decision I would have made.
That's right.
So I ended up at Wisconsin after only 1 year at Leeds, and so my master's degree was, in a sense, a fragment of what was supposed to have been a PhD at Leeds.
Mm-hmm. And what year did you come then to?
1960.
1960. So what impact did Wisconsin in the 60s have on you?
Well, I mean, the first reaction, of course, was real culture shock in a negative way. First of all, cost of living to a Brit in 1960 was staggering. I mean, I still remember not having a haircut because haircuts were ridiculously expensive. Food was expensive. There was a kind of real shock of living standards, which is, I think, nowhere near as great as it is now. Secondly, I felt that my undergraduate education had been very demanding, and I found, particularly as a TA, teaching freshmen at Wisconsin seemed undemanding and bothered me. I think I've learned to cope with that better than I did at that time now. I understand why, because it's much less specialized. I found multiple choice examinations to be reprehensible. I found Midwestern piety, whether it be Lutheran, Catholic, or whatever, to be very strange, having grown up in an ultimately heathen culture, because the north of England was ultimately a heathen culture. So there were many things that seemed unusual to me. On the other hand, I entered the State Historical Society Library and the main library. There's not a library outside the British Museum as good as that. The first seminar I took at Wisconsin, where there were 8 or 9 graduate students instead of 1 or 2, was quite remarkable. And finally, I was able to get additional coursework, which would have been impossible in England, in the areas of American history, statistical methods. I was able to continue my education in ways that would have been impossible. And finally, I began to bond with other grad students in ways that they created lifelong friendships that are still with me. And so within 3 months, or within 2 months, I sensed I was in an intellectual candy store. I overcame my frostiness and I think settled down, to feeling very, very comfortable on the campus.
Before we talk about your career as a university administrator, help us understand the sorts of research problems that became your focus so long as you remained an academic.
Mm-hmm. Well, my work in Leeds had curiously been on Leeds. Leeds was, like Manchester, a prototypical city of the 19th century, a relic landscape in many ways. Not much had happened since the Great War, the First World War. And so my generation, that is the late 50s, was the first generation to look at history from the bottom up, a kind of vernacular history, the history of voluntary organizations, the history of the working class, history of northern cities, not of the national government. So I was one of these pioneers who used Leeds as my laboratory to outline what were the geographic changes to a city between 1800 and 1900, using original documentation and also reading the landscape that's still left behind. And so when I came to North America, it was pretty obvious that this surge of interest in history from the bottom up, the new social history it was called, and the new urban history had really also just beginning to develop. And so I began to look at American cities with much of the same perspective, and looked at Chicago, New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, in particular, cities of the Northeastern and Midwestern America, and basically prepared myself to be sort of historical geography of the Industrial Revolution. And my PhD was a fragment of that interest titled 19th Century Boston, the Geographic Transformation of an American City During Industrialization. So a lifelong commitment to the study of the industrial effects on urban life, including immigration, including the rise of the factory, including the rise of modern transportation, the development of suburbs, all of those things were wrapped into this. And throughout my period as a teacher at Wisconsin, I taught a course called The Historical Geography of the American City, which was basically took it from the colonial times to the 20th century. And that was the kind of bread and butter course that I taught there that was very popular and for which had a very close association with me as an academic.
What in your, not in your academic background, but this early phase of your life growing up in Manchester, how did that impact this research focus, do you think? It sounds like you were studying problems that would have been of interest to that city, actually.
Yeah, I think so. I think that growing up, being reflective of the city I grew up, knowing that Manchester was the shock city, the sort of Chicago of the early 19th century, as Chicago was of the early 20th century, or LA is of the late 20th century. It was, to have lived in a city that you knew was a museum of the past had a big effect on me. I think knowing where, you know, just the world my grandparents came from, being curious about that, and then recognizing that the landscape itself was a museum. I think that brought this history and geography together. I mean, you could literally look at a slum, you could literally look at a neighborhood, and in 1955, it was not that much different than it might have been in 1870. And I was a very keen photographer, by the way. I took a lot of, in fact, some of the photographs I took are now in archives in Leeds and Manchester, where I, in a sense, because these have been knocked down in the 70s and 80s. But when I was growing up, the museum-like character to this society was still there. I also realized that poor people did not necessarily have to be socially disorganized, so that the world I grew up in was not one of poverty, but certainly not one of great wealth. And it was a very organized society, a society of great integrity, either through trade unions on the one hand or through kind of entrepreneurial ambition on the other hand, both side by side. So the idea that great cities were necessarily the pits didn't necessarily fit my picture of it. So I think there was some feedback between my reinterpretation of the past and a kind of living past that I experienced growing up.
So you went on then in Wisconsin not only to get your degree, but to become a member of the department, chairman of the department, provost, and then finally in the 90s, Chancellor of the University of Wisconsin. So let's move into a discussion of that. How did you come to be an administrator? Did it just happen naturally?
No, I think it was a pure accident. I think that when I went through the ranks in geography. I was teaching regularly. I had well over 20 graduate students who were following through in different cities and different eras, my own interest in urban history. I'd become president of the Association of American Geographers. I'd kind of got all the conventional awards, the Guggenheim and ACLS. I'd been, so I was a geographer. There was no question about it. But I had always had a strong interest in governance of the university. I'd always had this sense of citizenship. And therefore, I'd been, even though I was committed to research and teaching, I had a reasonably good record, either as a faculty senator, on committees that looked at programs, and above all, a committee that allocated internal research funding, which I think gave me a certain visibility and a reputation for being both tough and fair. And it was as a result of that that I became an associate dean in the graduate school, which is a part-time job. I still had very little effect on my research or teaching, but I wasn't, and that gave me a little visibility on campus. I concluded that that was going nowhere and went back to the department full-time and was approached by the University of London to be a visiting professor, and they were even, I think, flirting with the idea that I might return to London, as by now I was an American citizen, I'm a bicentennial citizen, I'm hyper-American in behavior, but the Brits were still interested that maybe I should return. So University of London, I was there and teaching Brits. I've got an interesting anecdote. Halfway through the course, a young lady came up to me and wanted to know where I was from. And I said, "You don't know?" She said, "No." I said, "Why don't you guess?" I said, "Nova Scotia, New Zealand," all sorts of things. And finally, 2 weeks later, she came up to me and she said, "Were you once one of us?" So that was the moment where she realized I might have been. So I was sufficiently exotic for them not to recognize it when I was teaching. So anyway, I get this phone call while still flirting with the University of London, University College London. And obviously a very aggressive lady's on the phone. She says, "My name's Donna Shalala. I'm the new chancellor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Everybody tells me you know how this place works. When you come back, I want you to pay a visit." So Judith and I, my wife, who is American, born in Chicago, we decided, we had children in the, we said, "No, we're Americans. It's nice to visit England for a year. We're going to come back." So we went back to Madison. So I went to visit her. She said, "Well, you notice there's quite a few vacancies administratively here now." And I was a little shocked because this was not, I was back in geography. I just finished the book that was published in 1989. I was in the middle of a sequel to that book, actually. And she said, "Well, there are 3 vacancies, Dean of Letters and Science, Dean of the Graduate School, and Provost and Vice Chancellor. Which of these would you like? If and when would you like to apply for, basically, because it was a proper search?" I said, "Well, I think Dean of Letters and Science is my thing." She said, "Well, I think you should apply for all of them." So I did apply for all of them, or people may have nominated me, and there was, the usual search, outside candidates and all of this. And so I was shortlisted for all 3, which was a little surprise to me, because, my only experience was as an associate dean in the graduate school, and there were many deans who were candidates. So I went in there, and Donna said, "Well, which of these jobs would you like?" I said, "Dean of Letters and Science." She said, "You can't have it." So I said, "Well, that's the one that I'm most qualified for." She said, "Well, I think you'd be an ideal vice chancellor." So I said to her, I said, "Well, I'm either going to fail and go back to the faculty, or I'm going to succeed and be a chancellor. I'm not sure I'm made of the political stuff to be a chancellor." She said, "You don't fool me for 1 minute."
I see.
So I went away and talked to my wife, and so I said, "This lady wants me to be her deputy." And so Judith had been pretty active in state politics. She'd worked for the state and also for the system administration. And she said, she must know something about you that we don't know, but maybe you should risk it. So I did. And we became known as the odd couple, affectionately, because we were so different. But we were a great team. And in some ways, she was a mentor, although I think she would agree that she learned as much from me as I did from her. And so in some senses, it was her confidence in me, her desire to have an insider from the scholarly side of the faculty to help her with her reform agenda. So I was, in a sense, an unlikely candidate. And in fact, it was a surprise. I was a very surprise appointment.
And so when she became, so you served under her for about 4 years,
right.
And then when she became President Clinton's Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare, you were named Chancellor.
Yeah, after a search again. So the Board of Regents, as they would here, would go through a search, and there was a short list of 3, and and then they chose me.
A leader of a university strikes me as being somebody who has to lead but also be a manager. Let's talk about those two roles. What are the skills required to be an effective leader of a campus?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think to know the product. I think the biggest thing is to recognize that what we're about is the agitation of young minds and the advancement of knowledge. And if you don't have a kind of gut relationship to that, which can happen if you appoint, for example, a corporate executive from the automobile industry. I mean, I really do think and to have perhaps participated, for however briefly, in the experience of teaching and research. I think if you don't have that, a pure management skill can't replace that. So what I call know the product or know what we're about. I think the second thing is to recognize that there's a very unique culture which is very, very agile and very individualistic and very, very creative in university. And that's the culture. It's not the culture of a bureaucracy, even though we sometimes behave that way. It's not the culture of a widget manufacturer. It's not even the culture of an arts institute. It's a very unusual culture, which has got very adaptable, very agile, and if you can recognize its strengths, you can do good things. If you recognize that it's a problem, then I think you can be paralyzed. So that would be number two, to recognize that the culture is in fact clearly a positive place to do change if you want. And then I think the third thing about an institution is to understand it's a very, very weak communication structure. So that if you don't have a strategy to communicate effectively, either personally or through some system or other, you will very quickly be isolated because everybody's too busy. Most people don't have time to read things that are about there. They're too busy doing research and teaching. So I think those three things are things that you have to face almost immediately. Those are challenges that you have to face, and that really means that you have to have some inner conviction about the nature of higher education. If you don't have that, I think you'll just end up minding the store for a few years.
So in a way, that it's a plus to have been an insider to this institution.
Well, I think it's a good question. I mean, my view is the more unique the culture, and perhaps the more esteemed the culture of the university, the more likely an insider will succeed. Whereas I think you can perhaps transfer certain skills down the system. So a person could be a provost at UCLA and go to, I won't say where, but somewhere else that is perhaps not so esteemed and do very well. I think it's very hard to move up the system and do very well, unless perhaps you previously had an appointment there. I mean, you could perhaps have been a dean and went somewhere else and then came back as a chancellor. On the other hand, I always believe that truly great institutions need an outsider every so often, that there's a sort of inbrededness that develops, and it's up to the Board of Regents and perhaps the faculty themselves to recognize that from time to time you need an outsider. But on the whole, I do believe that the more distinguished, the more esteemed an institution is, the tougher it is for an outsider to run it.
In terms of actually running the place, I get the sense from reading your speeches and interviews that you feel strongly that there has to be a plan, a vision for the future, and that has to be communicated.
Right.
How do you do that?
Well, my way of doing that was to recognize that there are certain problems that you have. To start with problems, some people would argue crisis. In my case, it was to say, it does seem to me that we make a case that we do outreach, research, and undergraduate education, and we orchestrally tie them together. But we never ask whether we do a very good job of doing that. And in my belief is that when I became provost, that people were not as satisfied with outreach and undergraduate education as they were with graduate education and research. And there was a beginning of, I think, of a certain resentment in the state legislature, in the public, among some of our undergraduates, particularly in the late 80s, that there was a problem. I also got a feeling that members of the private sector weren't sure that our knowledge transfer was as effective as it might have been earlier in the century. Government also felt a little alienated from us. And so my view was to take that problem and try and say, how do we resolve that problem? And the means to do that is to create a plan to solve it that has high legitimacy and high autonomy. That is, it's our solution, it's autonomy, but it's got great legitimacy inside. How do you do that? Well, what I did was take the accrediting exercise, which is usually viewed as very formal and inconsequential, and took the self-study that precedes the accreditation exercise and try to see if we could develop a strategic plan and vision out of the self-indictment that came out of that accreditation review, that our self-study did say that we didn't treat freshmen as well as we could. It did seem that we were not as mission-driven as we should have been, and that awareness, I think, resulted in a self-study. That self-study, I then drafted a kind of strategic plan derived from the findings of that self-study and then peddled it around the campus. And it was negotiable, and after about 2 years, wasn't done that quickly, everybody sort of came up with the feeling, yeah, this is a good thing to work on for the next 5 years. There's sort of some bounds here, there's some directions here, and it will be good for us. And eventually, the contrarian culture that had basically resisted this concluded this was a good idea. The second reason, and it began to address real problems. The second reason was that the faculty and administrators also recognized that the state was squeezing us. And it was very hard to explain to them what we were doing in their language. The strategic plan was very easily adaptable to meet outside needs, so that even though it had got its original legitimacy on the inside, we changed the words, but there was a sense of direction, and that began to improve external relations, and then that helped the inside. So that's how it was developed, and it was really the first strategic plan the campus had ever had.
And in short form, 4 themes that you embraced in that plan: embrace emerging technology, pursue global connections, break down the boundaries between programs, expand the learning experiences beyond campus borders. So in other words, it was stated in simple language, so all the constituencies could understand it, but bottom line was there was meaning to each one of these.
Right. And it didn't really attack the existing strength of the place. You know, in other words, what we tried to do was stretch ourselves and extend ourselves by these things. This assumed that, you know, departments were in good shape, they were delivering things in effective ways, but that alone would be enough. And I think the key breakthrough, which made the strategic plan visionary rather than ordinary, was a statement that I made was something like this, that a mission is doing what you should do well. A vision is imagining what you should be doing 5 years from now, a moving target, and doing that well. And that was the stretch of this plan, was to move it from simply saying we will do what we're already doing, but we will do some things differently. We won't simply do what we're doing now better, we will actually do some things differently.
Now, let's focus on, we can't talk about all of these, but let's focus on one, because one of the insights that you brought to this job was where the university, because of its emphasis on disciplines, wasn't doing all that it might do or become all that it might become. You talk about disciplines being horizontal mine shafts, and
disciplines being mine shafts,
with
no horizontal linkages.
Yeah, right. Sorry about that. Yeah. So that part of the task became breaking down interdisciplinary barriers. So how did you go about doing that?
Well, first of all, was to say there are many faculty out there who share this value. They've been there forever, not just, I mean, they go back to Alexander von Humboldt in Germany.
That's right.
You know, so there's nothing new about it. So the question is, how could you tap into the strength that was already there? And there were areas of campus where this was there. I chose actually 3 areas where I thought there would be responsiveness. The first of these was the coming together of area studies as global or international studies. And I had felt that as a geographer, the area studies were almost becoming parodies of departments rather than, in a sense, what they ought to be, encouraging, in a sense, a fuller global view of this sort of global village. And I found that, in fact, area studies people are very responsive. They're by nature interdisciplinary, and although they're concerned about how much money goes to Asia versus Europe, in the end, I think with the right leadership, that was possible. The second area was the arts, where how music, theater, the new the digital revolution in terms of arts, how was that coming together? And again, I think they were just waiting for almost authentication. they too created an arts institute for the first time and began to work together and also to serve the community in a very, very different way than they had. And then the final area was driven more by sort of intellectual changes of the time, and that was the rise of genetics or of various kinds of microbiology, which just simply redefined the boundaries. I didn't do that. I mean, it was like this explosion and transformation of knowledge itself, and the departmental structure in biology was simply obsolete. It certainly happened at Berkeley, and you created a College of Biology. We had very similar things. And again, so we simply tried to harness these changes and then highlight them. And then, of course, we began to get other proposals to collaborate. And my final act as Chancellor was to create and authorize, with the help actually of a significant appropriation from the state, a cluster appointment program where 150 positions were held in a bank and could be got at by department chairs and program directors only if they allied with other programs and made a proposal for a sort of 5 to 10 year commonality of research. And that program has proved to be a great stimulus to creating interdisciplinary work within the disciplines rather than having them in conflict with the disciplines.
And you said in a speech as Chancellor, it's a matter of how you infect the change that is already within the culture.
Right. I did no, all I did was either accelerate or put exponents on change that was already there. If it was not there already, it's very hard for an executive to sort of initiate something which doesn't exist in the culture. I think you can do that in the private sector, but in a university, if it's not embedded within the culture and it's there in a viral form somewhere, it's almost impossible to do it.
Now, the University of Wisconsin is the creature, the product of a state and its culture and its politics. Talk a little about that. That is the part of your program that had to be defining Wisconsin's niche, both in the international intellectual community, but also within the state.
Well, I think the most interesting thing is that University of Wisconsin-Madison is generally ranked in terms of research artillery third or fourth. Michigan and Berkeley, we do agree, got a little more strength across the board, faculty-wise, but we're there. Mm-hmm. But then you say, but this is a state of 5 million people. This is like having a great university in Norway compared to Germany, if you think of California and Wisconsin. How does a state that's very average in wealth, has gone through the Rust Belt experience, and still has a university that is able to do this? Part of it is, of course, federal funding, but there is a sustained threshold level of state support. And I think what began to happen is that the state worried that in supporting this reputation, it was not committing itself enough to undergraduates, to the kids who were coming from Wisconsin high schools. So one of the very special challenges you face is the idea that you've got to balance out this commitment to research with some sort of commitment to undergraduate education. And that was a very real challenge that Shalala recognized when she arrived. And so the intensity of the interest of the legislature in our research mission diminished as they felt we weren't doing a very good job with undergraduates. Once we began to do a much better job with undergraduates, the legislature began to be very happy about the research. So number one was you cannot get credit for this active research institution without treating freshmen well. The second thing was they didn't think that our knowledge transfer was working to the benefit of the economy. In 1988, the Rust Belt still seemed to be all over the place. And that was when we began to develop, well, pretentiously, a mini Silicon Valley. Biotech firms began to develop information science firms. And by the mid-90s, there clearly had been a kind of new knowledge revival in Wisconsin, in and around Madison in particular. So that, too, seemed to be value. And so, all of a sudden, two things had happened. A kind of sense that knowledge transfer was benefiting society, and that knowledge transfer was benefiting high school graduates. Now it was just fine to be a great research university. The triangle had to be put together. You couldn't just go out there and say, we're just going to be primarily a research university. And I think that demand is very strong in Wisconsin. In California, of course, it's divided among different kinds of institutions. But in a small state, that much greater pressure was put on UW-Madison because in a small state there could only be one research university. There's just not the resources there to have more than one.
As a manager, like all universities, you must have had to focus on your funding, the base of the funding, the movement toward greater private support. And that must have raised, for somebody who comes out of the university tradition, a responsibility to navigate those waters while maintaining the integrity and identity of the place. What was the key there in your efforts to manage the place fiscally in a responsible way, but on the other hand, maintain its integrity?
Well, first of all, again, to recognize that it was in the culture, and what I need to do is to change its magnitude. So in 1911, we received our first major private gift from a governor of Wisconsin called Vilas. And so the most prestigious chairs on the campus were known as Vilas professors. They'd been endowed since 1911, only 12, maybe 20 of them by now. In 1927, WRF was formed, which is the Wisconsin Alumni Research Foundation, which is a conduit for the development of patents and licenses and the creation of an endowment from the revenue. And in 1945, the University of Wisconsin Foundation was formed for philanthropic gifts. So that the three elements of private support were in place by 1945. And during the period from 1945 to about 1985, because of the amount of federal and state support, these endowments basically provided between 3 and 5% of our revenue, but it was very critical. It was frequently the most prestigious chairs, the most prestigious graduate fellowships. It was a means, it was like the margin of excellence. And so we'd been living with a public-private relationship for a long, long time. And between 1945 and 85, it was in this 3 to 5% range. But in the 80s, we had doubts about federal research funding, and the state began to squeeze. And in Wisconsin, tuition is always low. So there began to be a squeeze. And so the real question was, we certainly could use more of our private money. We could certainly raise more private money because Wisconsin alums are, many are successful and they're very tribal. And so we are very successful in raising money. And so Donna Shalala and I really faced that issue. We had to say, do we argue that right now we're unambiguously a public institution, but if we were to raise private support to 10% of our revenue, would it corrupt us or what? We came to the conclusion that there was no, that without doing that, we would not survive, and that we believe we could build in a sort of margin of excellence that was now 10% rather than 2, 3, or 4%. So we began a capital campaign. We began to strategically use our existing private resources, and ultimately, in fact, drove the amount of private support per annum probably 10 to 12% even. And then the question was, would the state just think, well, this is great, saving the taxpayer money, would they back off more and more? And what we kept saying is, we don't mind substituting for the margin of excellence, but we don't want any of the private money going for core activities. Parallel with all of this programmatic money was a great building boom that had to be done. We had a great backlog of capital investments. And so here again we had to decide, did the state have the bonding capacity to build the 15 or 16 buildings which, when Donna first arrived on the scene and I was provost, could be done? So again, we needed to say, why not give the state a proposal where we would put up 25%, a third, or half, whatever it may be. So we had two problems going on. We had an operating budget where we were growing the budget, and then we had this capital budget, which we knew was urgent as the biotech revolution was coming along. We knew it was, and the instructional technology, we needed to do this. And so we then said, well, maybe 25%, maybe a third. And so we began playing around with what is the threshold level of private support that will not deny our public character. Well, of course, what happens is that we were so damn successful that in the buildings, most of them were built with 50-50 rather than 1/3, 2/3, and we grew our private support in the operating budget probably close to 15%. And so in my last 2 years, my biggest task was to finally sign a new contract with the state, which said, you know, we've delivered on our side of the equation are you now going to agree that you will support the core needs of the campus so that I can grow that side, which is the margin of excellence? And that was, I think, why I was able to declare victory as Chancellor. The governor, a Republican governor who'd been very tough on the university, finally understood that the goose that was laying the golden egg, the private piece, could get to the point where these private supporters of a public university say, I don't want to substitute for public money, I just want to make a public university greater. And I got some of our alums to make those kinds of statements. And finally, the state, for the first time in over 14 years, increased our operating budget. And we began to start agreeing about that the threshold level of support from the state should be around 1/4 of our budget. And then, of course, another almost 40% comes from the feds. And then we would provide between 10 and 15% from private sources, and then perhaps 10% from tuition. And the state began to buy into this new contract. So what they got out of it was a growth in the total budget of the university, infinitely better university. But on the other hand, they now had to recognize that somewhere around 1/4 of our revenue did have to be guaranteed by the taxpayer. And I believe that contract is something which there was broad bipartisan buy-in.
What, looking back at your days as Chancellor, what do you think surprised you most in terms of the tasks of leadership of running a university? What did you learn that you might not have brought to the table when you came in?
The fact that there seems to be when resources are on the table, it seems that there's as much passion about $1 as $1 million. And the lack of a sense of priority as we deal with this $1.5 billion enterprise, that you can be at a meeting in which $5,000 can take 3 hours and $5 million can take 5 minutes. There's such weak understanding of the relationship of the political economy of the enterprise to the functioning of the enterprise by so many people, and that you're almost privileged as a chancellor to become aware of that. And so I would be in meetings where frequently I would stop them after 5 minutes. I'd say, go away and do it. For $5,000, I can risk $5,000. Now, it's very irresponsible of me to have sometimes done that, and I only would ever do that with endowment money. And when I was pretty secure, the people had a good proposal. But at the event celebrating my departure, a named professor of history, they had several people saying nice things about me on video. And he said that his most memorable meeting was a proposal for freshman seminars that would be held in the dorms to enhance the life of the dorms. And he said we came in with this proposal, which we thought, as historians, was a huge amount of money. And we prepared and this, that, and the other. We thought it was going to be a 3-hour meeting. After 5 minutes, he said, stop. He said, you can have the money, go away and do it. And I did take risks that way, where frequently some of the most impressive things we achieved were rounding error in a $1.5 billion budget. And my ability to understand that early on, I think, helped me not waste a lot of time on good things that cost virtually nothing and worrying about real things like how much is the state going to provide 10 years from now.
Looking back at your career, I would be fascinated to know how these pieces came together, your background from Manchester, your education as a geographer, your work as a lower-level administrator in the university. How do you think these pieces came together to make you an effective leader?
Well, I'm sure it's all unconscious, so I'm now reflecting consciously about things that may have happened unconsciously. I think growing up in a small business does give you a sort of sense of accountability, a kind of common sense attitude to managing something that's kind of like in your blood. I don't think anybody can grow up behind a store and not have that. Obviously, it's scaled disproportionately. I do think the depth of my understanding and participation in the academic enterprise, I will never underestimate. I believe I was a scholar, a serious scholar, that without that, it would have been very hard to run it. And then I would say the third thing probably may have been being a geographer. Geographers are very integrative people. They cross-wire things. They have a close relationship to regional planning, so that there is a kind of underlying organic planning that goes in the mentality of a geographer. So I think all three of those, if I were to look backwards, quite unconsciously probably played in a positive way in making me allegedly effective as a chancellor.
One final question. This would be advice for students. Let's draw on your knowledge as a chancellor. What advice would you have for students who want to get the most out of their education on the one hand and to prepare for the future on the other?
Well, my advice is always be pushy. I think most students on the whole are very restrained. On the whole, don't ask questions when they should. And I think often don't get the right advice the first time they try it. And so I think persistence is very important in finding out what the situation. Many students write examinations, for example, when the instructor would probably give them clues about the questions. There's much more knowledge out there that you can access by being somewhat pushy. So I think ask again would be number one. Number two would be to learn how to summarize, how to summarize and connect. These are skills people often take, I think, just to complete a record. Maybe if you're listening to a lecture, take notes every 5 minutes. Don't keep taking, And I think that that's this capacity to listen and summarize and to connect. I would say that would be very important. And the other thing would be to find, if not recreational or even service, to find something which fulfills other sides of your personality. Because as an undergraduate and a graduate student, your intellect is being engaged, pretty completely. And you have, in addition to sort of whatever emotional life you have, there's also a kind of priestly sort of a service function which should be met. And I think that you become a much more balanced person by figuring out whether that's through the arts, whether it's through service, whether it's through athletics, whatever it is, that ends up, I think, creating a more educated person. And most students, I think, let that fall by the wayside.
Chancellor Ward, on that word of advice, I want to thank you very much for taking time to be here today. And thank you very much for joining us for this conversation with history.